Thank you for joining our session. I'm Ann Barnhart, pronouns she, ella, an adjunct instructor at the iSchool of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I've been offering a course on library and information resources for Spanish-speaking populations at the iSchool for several years. This semester, a colleague from The Ohio State University, Pamela Espinosa de los Monteros, is co-teaching the course with me. We are joined today by several students who took or are currently enrolled in the course. From this semester, we have Leah Weatherall, Silvia Figueroa Ortiz, and Kriston Greer-Love. Eddie Kriston's joining us, who took the course in the summer of 2020, and Aldo Vasquez in the fall of 2018. Over the years, the content of the course has shifted, but there have been some constants in the approach and in the goals for the course. Previous iterations of the course even included an optional trip to Guadalajara for the book fair, which I hope can be included again at some point in the future. I'm going to just talk briefly about these goals for the course, because I think the real value of today's presentation is your opportunity to hear from the students, since they are the future of our profession. Our students and recent alumni presenters will highlight what they took or are taking from the course and how they can use that in their professional positions. So in the course, we start by defining the terms we're going to use to have our conversations and examining assumptions we bring to the subject. We look at the Spanish language publishing industry so we can better understand the context in which we are working, and we challenge structural limitations. Some of the activities and assignments that have remained consistent throughout the iterations of the course include a library summary in which the students look at a community that a specific library serves and gather information about the communities to generate a report. Examining the materials that library has to determine how well it might meet the needs of the Spanish-speaking community. They also select titles to add to the collection in order to fill the gaps they discovered. And they critically examine the resources and services offered by that library. We also ask them to plan ahead to how they can use this in their own careers to work and advocate with these communities. As I mentioned, this semester, Pamela Espinosa de los Monteros, the Latin American Studies librarian at The Ohio State University, added some other elements to the course, and she will tell you about them.
Hola a todos, welcome. Thank you for joining us in our session. I'm so glad to be reunited with you all, my colleagues from San Diego. I just wanted to briefly mention some of the new curriculum that we have brought into the course this year. And one of the critical things was thinking about, how do we connect our practice with our courses? How do we use our courses to activate our students to address the inequities in our profession? Related to representation, the stories we preserve in our collection, and the ways of looking and knowing the world that we make accessible to our users. And specifically, those that are at the beginning of their process of imagining who they are, where they came from, and who knows their community. So we're very privileged to have in this course and to introduce the Class Book Box Project, which is an effort of the Ohio State University Center for Latin American Studies to support K-12 teachers to enhance their curriculum through Latin American and Latinx voices. And so I don't have to tell you, for those that are public librarians, the lack of representation that we see in our children's book, especially those that are in different languages. And so we really wanted to speak to this. And so we are creating a communal guide. So each student received a specific book that was selected, whether it was an Afro-Latinx voice, or it was a Latinx Latin American narrative or cuento. And each of them are creating a curricular page that is supporting a group of K-12 teachers throughout the country to create curriculum and introduce these books in their classes. So we know teachers this year, we are all very aware of how important they are. But how can we support them developing new curriculum? So part of the things that this LibGuide is going to have is information about the author, the illustrator, the cultural elements of this particular book. You know, what are some access points for different ages? How are you pronouncing some of the Spanish language words? What are the contexts of those words in our culture? And we're using library students to do this like they would normally do in their institutions, and making sure that we're supporting our teachers. And lastly, you know, just I want to give a big plug to the philosophy behind all of this project. And this is all coming from Dr. Patricia Enciso. If you haven't heard of her or read her literature, it's amazing, amazing. Thinking about multicultural literature and the importance of how it helps to connect us to stories of humanity. So I really encourage you there. And I have a little quote that hopefully you're taking a moment to read, just thinking about how incorporating these stories, we lack the representation in our collections, we lack the representation in our staffing, we lack the representation in our profession, but sometimes just having these stories can make a big difference. So I hope that you can explore this on your own, and maybe this has sparked an idea for you today. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Leah Weatherall, who is our current student enrolled in the course and who will graduate from the iSchool this May.
For my experience, I would say the biggest thing I took away is perspective. Um, First, with Spanish and Beyond, one of the things that we looked at in class were languages spoken in Spanish speaking countries. And one of the things that I found interesting were the endangered languages located within a single country, that we went through a guide through a map to see, and how limited those resources are provided for those languages. It was definitely an eye opening to those indigenous cultures that have to that are trying to live on these languages and don't really have a lot of support. Another thing was local history. One of the things that really enlightened me is doing research on the local history where I live for my library summary assignment. Before, I had no information on the area town that I focused on for the project. I didn't know that how deep their history was, and that like from migration patterns and how the area had changed over the years. So definitely was a great part of what I learned, because now I know a very big history of my own city that I lived in forever, and I didn't know about it, and how the library has really played a deep impact in their community, because they use this library as a source of like recreation and learning. The other topic is access to resources. In doing research, I found that these communities are sometimes neglected. Like in the case that the library I'm focused on for my library summary, the library has been closed since Hurricane Harvey back in 2017. And they're still waiting for repairs that they had received a grant for, and they still have not received repairs for the library. And with COVID, they shut down like all the libraries in the area. So they only been able to access resources like at a park. They have mobile book stations, but that was all that they were able to provide. They would have to go outside of their community to go to a library, and so that's another thing that I learned was like trying to find access for resources to these communities that are needed and that they shouldn't be neglected, because these are seen as their safe space to meet, do homework, and have various events. And the next one I had was a timeline assignment that we had in class where we picked a Latin American country. And the country that I chose was Panama. And I researched and learned some great history about the country and how those events affected the Panamanians there. And that perspective can change like how people view like the United States and various things. So when you're trying to I want to take that back when I am in my profession to be understanding of different cultures, like they have a different experience uh, than I do of like living in the United States or outside the country. So when I'm trying to help them, I want to be understanding of where they're coming from as well. And that leads to representation matters. Collections should reflect the community that it represents. Having points of view of Latinx authors is a great way to provide perspective to various communities. And this is what I really learned when you're doing like collection development and trying to display what your library provides to these communities so that people can go out there, they can go and check these books out to learn more about these communities, or that someone can feel heard or relate to their own experience, can make them feel more connected to the library, which I can take back into my own field. And now I'll turn it over to my classmate, Kirsten Greer Love, who also graduates this May.
It's an honor to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for having us. I have just loved this experience and this course this term. I came to library science as a lawyer, and my background was actually working with people in Mexico. So I worked as a civil rights lawyer in Mexico and then in New Mexico. And my experience there always sort of emphasized the importance of Indigenous languages in establishing rapport with clients. And so I was really happy to see that this course really emphasized the importance of Indigenous languages when we think about library collections and engaging with library users. This slide shows us the diversity of Indigenous languages across just Mexico, one country alone. And we can think about, when we think about the migration histories and stories of people who may have come from Mexico or whose family may have come from Mexico, even dozens or 100 years ago, they may carry with them those Indigenous languages and may continue to use them in the United States. And sometimes our demographic statistics in the United States about Spanish-speaking communities tend to conceal that rich diversity of Indigenous languages. So I appreciated that this course invited us to really critically consider how our library collections represent those languages. And one of the texts I most appreciated was Caroline Shipley's text on whether or not we can actually translate a text from Quechua. And Caroline Shipley speaks about how she spoke with writers and thinkers who use Quechua frequently, who were encouraging people not to translate text from Quechua to Spanish, and really inviting people to read and use and write resources in Quechua. So when we think about developing our library's collections, it's crucial that we think about, when we're taking in translated text, what that means, and seeing translation as a political act that can ultimately exclude Indigenous languages or exclude users who might speak those Indigenous languages from our communities at our libraries. So having the opportunity to really reflect on engaging with Indigenous users and of libraries and thinking about how their texts are represented in the library's collection was really beneficial for me. And I'm excited to continue thinking about these issues here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And with that, I'm really excited to introduce Silvia Figueroa Ortiz, a first-year student at the iSchool.
Hi, everyone. I am Silvia Fierortiz, pronouns she, her, hers. I am a first-year student at the MLIS program at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And I am super excited to be here today. I love this course and I found it so informative. So today I'm going to talk about the Spanish-speaking publishing industry. And coming into this course, I had experience working as a Spanish teacher in Boston. I was teaching in a predominantly Hispanic and immigrant community. And my experience with publishers was limited to more well-known educational material companies, such as Santillana. But when I tried to build a Spanish library for my students, the books that I could access were very limited, and it was very difficult for me to find materials for younger audiences and a type of like YA material that would interest them outside of just academic pursuits. So fast forwarding to the spring, in the course, we talked about the monopoly in the publishing industry. And most Spanish language publishers that are popular in the US come from a limited sampling of Latin American countries, such as Spain, Colombia, Mexico, etc. And the big houses are the ones that have access to the international market. So representation from most Latin American countries is extremely lacking. Independent publishers or self-published authors most rely on an intermediary or vendors that are going to connect them with the buyers and libraries in the US. So these vendors most of the times incur in financial risk to acquire these items for the library. So they must go on buy-in trips and acquire large quantities of items or just a small sampling. And it isn't until the libraries have these materials in their hands that they can pay these vendors. So the books might be affordable when you buy them directly from the country, but you have to factor in the cost of the vendor, the travel, the shipping, food, etc. And all this can amount to a hefty sum. And this was something that I would have never known had I not taken the course. And another issue is the content that these publishing houses are putting out. So how much original material comes from Latina writers, how many of them are being published versus how much of the English language works are translated into Spanish and again are being pushed out there. So for me, this explained the lack and the difficulty of finding materials for my school library, going back to what Pamela was talking at the beginning. That representation, it wasn't there, and finding it was extremely hard. And via the course, I was able to finally understand the complexities of this market. And I'm saying all this because I firmly believe after taking the class that courses like this are extremely important, especially with the growth of the Spanish-speaking population, with the growth of the Latina population that might not speak Spanish as their first language. And this is extremely important for future librarians. So thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Aldo Vasquez.
Everyone, my name is Arda Vasquez, pronouns he, him, his. I'm honored to be here today to share my experiences as a student and now working in a public library. So during my time in Anne's course, I learned the importance of adapting to the needs of our Spanish-speaking populations. Now more than ever, public librarians must learn to overcome new challenges in order to provide beneficial services for our patrons. Today, I will talk about two examples that I have encountered while working as a children's librarian at the Chicago Public Library. Each year, librarians at the Chicago Public Library read a lot of children's books to determine which titles are the best of the best for children in Chicago. For the first time last year, children's books in Spanish were added to the list of the best titles as its own category. This list of titles featured both Spanish language and bilingual books that would be excellent additions to any classroom, book club, or story time. Books were selected by Spanish-speaking librarians who currently work in communities that serve Spanish-speaking populations, ensuring that these titles are representative of the patrons that we serve. Normally, we would book talk our best of the best selections to Chicago Public Library children's librarians and teachers at our main public library. But due to COVID, we recorded our book talks and made the video public on our YouTube channel. This video was done entirely in Spanish and can be viewed on our CPL YouTube page by anyone. We plan to continue this model in the future, hopefully allowing more Spanish-speaking families and educators in our communities a chance to learn about some of the best children's books currently available in Spanish. Since the pandemic, in-person programming has not been offered at any of our Chicago Public Library branches. In an effort to serve our Spanish-speaking populations, a committee was formed to create and provide virtual Spanish story times. Connecting to communities through a virtual setting has presented a number of challenges, but also has created some unique opportunities for our staff to develop more substantial program offerings to a wider audience. Librarians have begun working together to promote, develop, and lead programs that are offered in Spanish. But before the pandemic, patrons would need to seek out particular branch locations for Spanish story times. But now these are available through a virtual setting for all of our patrons across our city. During the pandemic, librarians have also created STEAM-themed grab-and-go kits for children with an effort to provide activity instructions in Spanish. A resource guide is currently being developed by librarians that provides examples of rhymes, songs, and stories in Spanish. We hope to continue to address the need for more Spanish language programming and accessibility for all of our patrons. Now, our next speaker, Eddie Kriston, took this course in summer 2020 in his last semester before graduating. As a community builder, Eddie was named one of the movers and shakers in 2020 by Library Journal. Eddie currently works as a reference librarian and staff training coordinator at the Warren Newport Public Library in Gurnee, Illinois.
Hello, my name is Eddie Kriston. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm here to talk about how meaningful and effective Anne's course was for me in my first steps as a public librarian in a community with an underserved and underrepresented Spanish-speaking community. This was probably the most practical and impactful course I took in my graduate program. I'm extremely grateful for the scope and the influence of the course. Subjects like understanding the Spanish language publishing world, the significance of self-identification, and the importance of reaching out to be among Spanish-speaking communities for better representation are already at work in my approach as a librarian. Starting with the library summary we conducted, my library serves 2 townships with 6 municipalities and 80,000 cardholders, and is at least as many active reciprocal users, 12% in Gurnee, 18% in Park City, 30% in Grandwood, and over 55% of residents in Waukegan identify as Hispanic or Latinx, which includes large populations of residents originally from Mexico, specifically Tampico, north of Mexico City, but as well as Puerto Rico and Honduras. Despite being a lifelong patron of my library and an employee for 6 years before I started my program, I did not know any of these demographic informations prior to starting my class. I learned to immediately advocate for both budget and hiring attention to be allocated for Spanish-speaking representation on staff after this course. And I was able to successfully lobby for a change to the position I had left in administration in conjunction with some other vacancies that had occurred before the pandemic to create a more customer service oriented position rather than purely policy enforcement and safety manager. I was placed in charge of hiring that position and was able to cast a wider net outside of library circles to include institutions and networks that I identified in my work for this course to prioritize hiring a Spanish-speaking professional for a sustainable professional level position with administrative support. He's been in that new role since November, and he has a voice in equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. This class also introduced me to the community ambassador model of outreach. In December, we were actually able to get Carmen Patlan from the Highwood Public Library, who is the creator of the Promotores model that we read about in our class. Carmen met with my director and some of the management team to advise and advocate for better allyship, advocacy, and agency for our Spanish-speaking patrons. And we're currently in the process of recruiting community ambassadors, again, using the same institutions identified for partnership in my final dossier of the 590 course. So because of tools and trainings from this course, our community will finally have the beginnings of own voices advocacy in the library. The collection development and resources elements of this course were some of the most interesting and practical work that I got to do in this program. I now know how to purchase Spanish language DVDs at reasonable prices that will play on locally purchased machines. I went from choosing titles for a project in class to purchasing graphic novels in my new job and being aware of and able to navigate Spanish language publications, as well as market them in my library and community in more accessible ways. The deeper philosophical concerns that I took away from this course and the understanding of my responsibility to Spanish-speaking patrons and professionals will be a foundation to my advocacy and allyship in all aspects of my life as a librarian. In this course, we covered history and makeup of Spanish-speaking populations and the nature of self-identification, which was extremely important for me to understand the diversity in the community that I serve. We also covered their experience with libraries and access to Spanish language publications, which was fascinating for both a deeper understanding of the publishing industry and, like I mentioned before, for practical selection and marketing of collections. All of this was a huge uncovering of how my assumptions about the Spanish-speaking populations that I grew up in and around were excluding the experience and needs of a lot of my patrons. This class emphasized strong, non-performative, meaningful allyship and advocacy strategies. Myself and another student were assigned an independent project on the topic to present to the rest of the class, which is an incredible way to retain information and spark good discussion. The assignments were always practical, the materials were life-changing, and the class discussions were incredible. I would advocate for every MLIS program to have a course like this because it will make a difference for in libraries for your Spanish-speaking patrons. It was a challenging course that developed us professionally by challenging our assumptions, laying a foundation to reach the communities that we serve, and giving us a chance to gain confidence and competence through assignments that prepared us for real life service. So, thank you, and back to Anne.
I want to thank all of our presenters. So thank you, Pamela, Leah, Kriston, Silvia, Aldo, and Eddie for taking the time to do this. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference for having us and letting us to join. I know that when I said, how about we have a big panel of students, and I'll let you know who's going to be on it closer to the time of the conference, that might have made some of the conference organizers a little nervous. So I appreciate that they went with it. And we have time for questions. And I hope that we can have a rich discussion. And I want to remind you all as well that there is a link for a survey.